Welcome, dear listeners, to a journey through time, a story that will carry you gently into the realm of dreams while we explore one of history's most fascinating maritime disasters. Tonight, we're going to embark on an imaginary voyage aboard the RMS Titanic. But this isn't just any story. This is a tale that will help you understand why, despite all our modern knowledge and hindsight, surviving on that magnificent ship would have been far more challenging than you might imagine. Close your eyes now and let your breathing slow and deepen. Feel yourself sinking into your bed, into comfort, into the rhythm of this story. We're going to take our time tonight, exploring every detail, every nuance of life aboard the Titanic, and why the odds would have been stacked against you from the very beginning. Picture yourself now, standing on the Southampton docks on April 10th, 1912. The air is crisp with the promise of spring, and before you rises the most magnificent ship ever built. The RMS Titanic stretches nearly 900 feet long, her four massive funnels reaching toward the gray English sky like the towers of a floating cathedral. You can hear the gentle lapping of water against her hull, the distant calls of seagulls, and the excited chatter of passengers preparing to embark on the voyage of a lifetime. But as we'll discover together in this long, peaceful journey through history, your survival would depend on far more than luck. It would depend on your social class, your location on the ship, your knowledge of maritime procedures, and dozens of other factors that were largely beyond your control. Let's begin our story by stepping aboard this floating palace, and I'll show you exactly why your chances of seeing New York Harbor would have been slimmer than you think. Chapter 1. Boarding and First Impressions. As you climb the gangway, feel the solid weight of the ship beneath your feet. The Titanic doesn't rock or sway like smaller vessels. She's so massive that she feels almost like stepping onto solid ground. The wood beneath your shoes is polished to a mirror shine, and everywhere you look, there's evidence of incredible craftsmanship and attention to detail. But here's your first challenge. Where exactly are you on this ship? Your survival chances are already being determined by factors you might not even realize. If you're like most people listening to this story, you might imagine yourself as a first-class passenger, enjoying the luxury suites and elegant dining rooms. But statistically speaking, you would most likely have been traveling in third class, also known as steerage. Let me paint you a picture of what that means. As a third-class passenger, you wouldn't be admiring the grand staircase with its ornate clock and cherub statue. Instead, you'd be making your way deep into the ship's interior, down narrow corridors that smell of fresh paint and engine oil, carrying your few possessions in a worn suitcase or canvas bag. Your cabin, if you're lucky enough not to be sharing, would be small but surprisingly clean and modern for 1912. The White Star Line took pride in offering third-class accommodations that were superior to many other ships' second-class quarters. You'd have electric lighting, running water, and even heat. Luxuries that many of you wouldn't have had at home. But here's what you might not know. Your location deep in the ship has already sealed your fate in ways you can't imagine. While first-class passengers could step directly onto the boat deck from their suites, you're now situated 6 decks below, behind gates and barriers, in a maze of corridors that you're only just beginning to learn. As you settle into your cabin, listen to the sounds around you. The constant hum of the ship's engines, a sound so deep and powerful that you feel it in your chest as much as hear it. The creaking of metal and wood as this enormous structure flexes gently with the movement of the water. Conversations in a dozen different languages echoing through the corridors families heading to America for new opportunities, young men seeking work, couples starting their lives together. Take a moment to imagine the hopes and dreams of your fellow passengers. Mrs. O'Brien from County Cork, traveling with her 3 young children to meet her husband in Boston. Eric and his brother from Sweden, carrying tools and determination to find work in the steel mills of Pennsylvania. The Sage family, all 11 of them. The largest family group on board, dreaming of a farm in Kansas. But as you drift deeper into this story, as your breathing becomes slower and more regular, consider this sobering reality. You don't yet know the ship's layout. You don't know where the lifeboats are. You don't know the quickest routes to the upper decks. And most importantly, you don't know that in just 4 days, this knowledge will mean the difference between life and death. The ship's designers and officers believed they had created something unsinkable. They had divided the hull into 16 watertight compartments, with doors that could be closed electronically from the bridge. They calculated that even if 4 of these compartments flooded, the ship would remain afloat. This gave everyone, crew and passengers alike, a sense of security that would prove tragically false. As you explore your new temporary home during these first hours aboard, you're forming mental maps of corridors and stairways. But these maps are incomplete, and in the darkness and chaos of a sinking ship, incomplete knowledge becomes deadly ignorance. Chapter 2: The Social Hierarchy and Your Place in It. Now, as we continue our gentle journey toward sleep, let's explore how the rigid social structure of 1912 would have determined not just your comfort level aboard the Titanic, but your very chances of survival. Imagine for a moment that you could move freely through all areas of the ship. Let's start at the top and work our way down, like descending through the layers of society itself. On the boat deck and A deck, you would find yourself in a world of unprecedented luxury. The first-class suites were more opulent than most people's homes. Take the Cardiza family suite, for instance. It consisted of 2 bedrooms, 2 wardrobe rooms, a sitting room, and a private promenade deck. The cost? $4,350, equivalent to about $130,000 today just for the passage. Here you dine on dishes prepared by French chefs, served on china bearing the White Star Line's flag, in a dining room that seated 554 people beneath a massive glass dome. The menu for first-class passengers included 11 courses on some nights. Oysters consommé, turbot with hollandaise, chicken lyonnaise, beef sirloin, green peas, parmentier potatoes, punch romaine to cleanse the palate, roast duckling, chocolate and vanilla eclairs, and French ice cream. But here's what's crucial for our story. If you were a first-class passenger, you lived on the upper decks. When disaster struck, you were already close to the lifeboats. You had space to move, wide corridors, and most importantly, immediate access to information and assistance from the crew. Now, let your mind drift down to second class, where you might find yourself if you were a middle-class traveler, perhaps a teacher, a small business owner, or a skilled craftsman. Second class on the Titanic was equivalent to first class on most other ships. You'd have a comfortable cabin, access to a well-appointed dining room, and a library where you could read and write letters home. Second-class passengers included Father Thomas Biles, a Catholic priest traveling to New York to officiate at his brother's wedding, and the 8 members of the ship's band, who were technically second-class passengers when they weren't performing. Your chances of survival would be better than those in third class, but you'd still face significant challenges. You'd be located on decks D, E, and F, higher than third class, but still requiring you to navigate several levels and multiple corridors to reach the boat deck. In the confusion of an emergency, these extra minutes and additional complexity could prove fatal. But most likely, as I mentioned earlier, you'd be traveling in third class. And this is where our story becomes particularly important for understanding survival. Third-class passengers weren't just physically separated from the upper classes. They were systematically isolated. White Star Line, like other shipping companies, was required by immigration laws to keep third-class passengers separate from first and second class. This wasn't just snobbery. It was legal requirement designed to prevent the spread of disease and to satisfy American immigration authorities. This meant that gates and barriers weren't just social constructs. They were physical barriers that could be locked and were often staffed by crew members whose job it was to maintain separation. During normal operations, you would need permission and escort to move between class areas. As a third-class passenger, you'd be housed primarily on decks E, F, and G, deep in the ship's interior. Some of the third-class cabins were actually below the waterline. Your dining room, your common areas, your entire world on the ship existed in the lower sections of the vessel. But here's what makes this particularly tragic. Third-class passengers on the Titanic were often the most resourceful, determined people on board. These were individuals and families who had sold everything they owned for the chance at a new life in America. They were survivors by nature, people who had already overcome tremendous obstacles just to afford their passage. Take the story of the Irish passengers from County Mayo. They had pooled their resources, sometimes entire extended families contributing to send their strongest young people to America, with the understanding that they would send money back home. These weren't weak or helpless people. They were the brave ones, the risk-takers, the dreamers. Yet their physical location on the ship and their unfamiliarity with maritime procedures would work against all their natural survival instincts. As you settle deeper into this story, feel your body relaxing further into your bed. Let the gentle rhythm of our tale carry you towards sleep, while we continue to explore why location, information, and access would have mattered more than courage or determination in the early hours of April 15th, 1912. Chapter 3: Daily Life and Learning the Ship. For the next portion of our journey toward peaceful sleep, let's walk through what your days would have been like aboard the Titanic, and how the routines and rhythms of ship life would have both helped and hindered your chances of survival. Picture yourself waking up on April 11th, your first full day at sea. The ship is moving smoothly through calm waters, and you can hear the gentle sounds of a floating city coming to life around you. Footsteps in the corridors above and below, the distant clatter of dishes from the kitchens, muffled conversations through thin cabin walls. If you're in third class, your day begins early. The dining room serves breakfast in 2 sittings to accommodate all the passengers, and you need to be prompt to ensure you get your meal. The food is substantial and well prepared. Porridge, eggs, bacon, bread, and coffee or tea. It's better than what many passengers ate at home. And there's a sense of community as people share tables and begin to form friendships. But notice what you're not doing during these meals. You're not learning about emergency procedures. There are no safety briefings, no instruction on how to put on a life jacket, no explanation of what to do if the ship's alarm sounds. In 1912, this simply wasn't standard practice. The ship was considered so safe that detailed emergency procedures were deemed unnecessary for passengers. After breakfast, you might explore the ship within the areas available to you. third-class passengers had access to a general room where you could socialize, write letters, and read. There was also a smoking room for men, and a modest deck space where you could get fresh air and watch the ocean roll by. But here's a crucial detail for our story. As you explore, you're unconsciously creating a mental map of the ship. However, this map is limited and potentially misleading. You know how to get from your cabin to the dining room, to the general room, to the small section of deck where you're allowed. You know these routes well because you travel them multiple times each day. What you don't know, what you have no reason to learn, are the emergency routes. You don't know that there are alternative stairways you could use if your primary route becomes blocked. You don't know the location of life jacket storage areas. Most critically, you don't know the fastest way to reach the boat deck. During the day, you might see crew members going about their duties, but you probably don't think to ask them about emergency procedures. Why would you? The ship is magnificent, solid, and safe. The crew appears competent and professional. Everything runs like clockwork. You might spend time reading in the third-class general room, which had a piano and was decorated modestly but pleasantly. Here, you'd meet other passengers, share stories of your homeland and your hopes for America. You might learn that the man at the next table is a blacksmith from Sweden, that the young woman by the window is traveling to meet her fiancé in Chicago, that the elderly couple in the corner are going to live with their daughter in Boston. These social connections are wonderful, but they're also creating a dangerous sense of security. Everyone around you seems calm and confident. The ship is running smoothly. The officers and crew you see appear professional and knowledgeable. There's no reason to worry, no reason to ask difficult questions about what would happen in an emergency. In the evenings, there might be informal entertainment in the general room. Someone would play the piano. People would sing songs from their homeland. Children would play simple games. These are peaceful, pleasant hours that help pass the time during the long ocean crossing. But as you participate in these activities, as you settle into the rhythm of ship life, you're not thinking about survival. You're thinking about arrival, about your new life in America, about reuniting with family or starting fresh in a new country. The crew, meanwhile, is following their own routines. They conduct safety drills, but these are for crew members only. Passengers aren't involved and often aren't even aware they're happening. The officers inspect the lifeboats and safety equipment, but this is done quietly, professionally, without fanfare or passenger involvement. Captain Smith himself was nearing retirement. This voyage was to be his last before stepping down from his position as Commodore of the White Star Line Fleet. He was experienced, respected, and confident. He had commanded ships for decades without serious incident. This confidence permeated the entire crew and, by extension, the passengers. By your third day at sea, April 13th, you've settled into a comfortable routine. You know when meals are served, where to find a quiet spot to read, how to stay warm on deck while getting fresh air. You're making friends, sharing meals with the same people, creating the temporary community that forms aboard any long voyage. But you still don't know where the life jackets are stored in your section of the ship. You've never seen a lifeboat drill. You don't know the sound of the ship's general alarm because you've never heard it. You don't know that the water temperature in the North Atlantic in April is cold enough to kill a person in 15 to 30 minutes, even if they're wearing a life jacket. As we continue our gentle journey towards sleep, let your breathing become even deeper and more regular. Feel yourself sinking further into comfort as we explore these details of daily life aboard the Titanic. These routines, these small daily pleasures, were creating a false sense of security that would prove tragically costly when routine gave way to catastrophe. Chapter 4. The night of April 14th. Building toward disaster. Now, as your body continues to relax and your mind drifts peacefully toward sleep, let's enter the final day of the Titanic's voyage. April 14th, 1912. This day began like any other, with no hint of the tragedy that would unfold under the star-filled North Atlantic sky. Imagine waking in your third-class cabin to another beautiful morning at sea. The ship is making excellent time. In fact, she's ahead of schedule. Captain Smith is considering arriving in New York early, which would be a triumph for the White Star Line and excellent publicity for their newest flagship. The morning routine unfolds as it has for the past 3 days. Breakfast in the third-class dining room, conversation with your new friends, perhaps a walk on the limited deck space available to you. The ocean is remarkably calm. Passengers and crew alike comment on how smooth the crossing has been. The weather is clear and cold, but inside the ship, everything is warm and comfortable. But while passengers go about their normal routines, the ship's officers are receiving wireless messages that should have alarmed them. Ice warnings. Multiple messages from other ships reporting icebergs in the area the Titanic is approaching. The steamship Californian, the Baltic, the America, all sending warnings about ice fields directly in the Titanic's path. You, of course, know nothing about these warnings. There's no reason you would. Passengers aren't informed about navigational hazards. That's the crew's responsibility. You trust that the officers are competent and will handle any challenges that arise. During the day, you might notice that the temperature is dropping. By afternoon, it's noticeably colder on deck. Cold enough that most passengers prefer to stay inside except for brief periods of fresh air. But this seems normal for April in the North Atlantic. You have no way of knowing that this temperature drop is a sign of nearby ice fields. The evening meal in third class is pleasant and social as always. You're beginning to know the preferences of your table companions. Mrs. Johnson always asks for extra bread. The young Swedish man practices his English with anyone willing to help. The Italian family with 3 children somehow manages to keep everyone fed and reasonably quiet despite the confined space. After dinner, some passengers head to the general room for the usual evening entertainment. Others write letters home, though they won't be mailed until the ship reaches New York. Still others simply retire early to their cabins, tired from the day and looking forward to their arrival in America. But here's what you don't know. Up on the bridge, officers are beginning to worry about ice. The temperature has dropped to just below freezing. The sea is unusually calm. So calm that it will be difficult to spot icebergs because there are no waves breaking against them. The night is moonless and extraordinarily dark. At 9 p.m., Captain Smith retires to his cabin, leaving First Officer Murdoch in charge of the bridge. Before leaving, Smith and Murdoch discuss the ice warnings and agree to maintain course and speed. The ship is traveling at nearly full speed, about 22.5 knots, through waters they know contain ice. Why would they take such a risk? The answer lies in the confidence of the age. This is 1912, the height of technological optimism. The Titanic represents the pinnacle of human engineering achievement. Her designers and builders have convinced everyone, including themselves, that she is practically unsinkable. Ice warnings seem like overcautious concern for a ship of this caliber. As you settle into your bunk for the night around 10 p.m., you can hear the familiar sounds of a ship at night. The constant thrumming of the engines, the creaking of metal and wood, the distant sound of voices from other cabins. These sounds have become comforting over the past 4 nights. They represent safety, progress, the steady approach toward your new life in America. In first class, passengers are enjoying their final evening aboard ship in style. The a la carte restaurant is serving its last dinner of the voyage to those wealthy enough to afford meals beyond the included dining room service. Men retire to the smoking room for cigars and brandy, discussing business deals and investment opportunities in America. In second class, passengers are packing their belongings and preparing for arrival in New York. Some are writing final letters to be mailed upon landing. Others are reviewing immigration documents and rehearsing answers to questions they expect to be asked at Ellis Island. But you, in third class, are simply tired and ready for sleep. Tomorrow will bring the excitement and chaos of arrival, immigration processing, and the beginning of your new life. Tonight is your last night to simply rest and dream aboard this magnificent ship. As you drift toward sleep in your narrow bunk, listen to the rhythm of the ship cutting through the water. Feel the gentle vibration of the massive engines driving you westward toward your destiny. Let the sound of distant conversations and settling metal lull you into deeper relaxation. You have no way of knowing that high above you, in the crow's nest, lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee are straining their eyes in the darkness, watching for the ice they know is somewhere ahead. They have no binoculars. The pair normally kept in the crow's nest has been misplaced since Southampton. They're relying entirely on their naked eyes to spot danger in the pitch-black night. At 11:30 p.m., most passengers are asleep or preparing for sleep. The ship continues at nearly full speed through the ice field, her officers confident in their technology and their experience. And you, deep in the ship's interior, surrounded by the sounds and sensations of peaceful night at sea, are about to face the greatest maritime disaster in history. Chapter 5, 11:40 p.m. The collision and first moments. Now, as your breathing becomes even deeper and more rhythmic, as you sink further into the comfort of your bed, let's approach the moment that changed everything. It's 11:40 p.m. on April 14th, 1912, and you're sleeping peacefully in your third-class cabin, deep in the interior of the RMS Titanic. High above you, in the crow's nest, lookout Frederick Fleet suddenly sees something that makes his blood freeze. A massive, dark shape directly ahead of the ship. An iceberg, huge and silent, looming out of the darkness like a mountain of ice and death. "Iceberg right ahead!" He shouts into the telephone to the bridge, then reaches for the warning bell and rings it 3 times. The traditional signal for danger, dead ahead. On the bridge, First Officer Murdoch receives the warning and immediately orders hard a starboard and full astern. He's trying to turn the ship away from the iceberg while reversing the engines to slow their approach. It's the right decision, but it comes too late. The Titanic is simply too big, too heavy, and moving too fast to avoid collision. But you, sleeping in your cabin 6 decks below, feel none of this drama. What you experience is much subtler and, in its very subtlety, much more dangerous. You might wake briefly to a slight tremor, a gentle vibration that seems different from the normal rhythm of the ship's engines. Some passengers later described it as feeling like the ship had rolled over 1,000 marbles. Others said it felt like a giant hand had gently shaken the vessel. The sound, if you heard it at all, was more like a distant rumble than a crash. This is your first challenge. The collision didn't feel catastrophic. It didn't throw you from your bunk or shatter windows or create obvious panic. Instead, it was subtle enough that many passengers slept through it entirely, and those who did wake weren't sure anything significant had happened. Let's say you do wake up. You lie in your bunk, listening, trying to determine what caused that unusual sensation. The engines, which have been your constant companions for 4 days, have stopped. This is more noticeable than the collision itself. The sudden absence of that deep, rhythmic thrumming that you've become accustomed to. You might hear voices in the corridor outside your cabin, other passengers also awakened by the change in the ship's rhythm. Someone might knock on doors, asking if others felt something unusual. But there's no immediate sense of alarm, no obvious signs of danger. This is where your location deep in the ship becomes critically important. Up on the higher decks, passengers and crew can see that chunks of ice have fallen onto the forward well deck. They can observe the ship's bow riding lower in the water. Some first-class passengers even play with pieces of ice that have fallen on the deck, treating it as a novelty. But you can see none of this. Your portholes, if your cabin has them, look out at ocean water. And in the darkness, you can't tell if the water level has changed. You have no visual reference points to help you understand what has happened. Meanwhile, far below you in the ship's bottom, seawater is pouring through a series of punctures and tears in the hull. The iceberg has damaged the ship along nearly 300 feet of her starboard side, opening the first 6 watertight compartments to the sea. The ship can survive flooding in 4 compartments, but not 6. The Titanic is doomed, though this won't become clear for another hour or more. Captain Smith, awakened by the collision, rushes to the bridge and orders the engine stopped and the watertight doors closed. He sends for Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, who was traveling aboard this maiden voyage. Together, they begin a survey of the damage. But you know none of this. You're trying to navigate through increasingly crowded corridors, past families carrying crying children, past men helping elderly passengers with their life jackets, past crew members who are moving with obvious urgency, but still can't provide clear answers about what passengers should do. Let's say you manage to find a stairway that leads upward. You begin climbing, but you quickly discover that not all stairways go where you expect them to. Some end at locked gates. Others lead to areas designated for different classes. The ship's layout, which seemed logical during normal operations, becomes a maze during an emergency. As you climb, you notice that the ship's angle is becoming more pronounced. Walking toward the stern, the back of the ship, now feels noticeably like walking uphill. The Titanic is settling by the head, her bow sinking deeper into the North Atlantic as millions of gallons of seawater pour into her forward compartments. Around 1 a.m., you finally manage to reach an upper deck. The scene that greets you is both encouraging and terrifying. There are indeed lifeboats, and crew members are working to load them. But the process is chaotic and slow. Many of the boats are being lowered only partially filled because passengers are reluctant to leave the apparent safety of the large ship for the uncertainty of a small boat on the dark ocean. The temperature is brutally cold, well below freezing. Your breath creates clouds of vapor, and the wind cuts through your clothes like ice. Many passengers who have made it to the boat deck are hesitating to get into the lifeboats because the Titanic still seems safer than the small boats being lowered into the darkness. This hesitation is killing people. Lifeboat after lifeboat is leaving the ship with empty seats. The crew members in charge of loading don't fully understand the urgency of the situation, and passengers can't believe that this enormous, stable-feeling ship could actually sink completely. If you're a man, your situation becomes even more desperate. The women and children first protocol isn't just a suggestion. It's being enforced strictly on most parts of the ship. You might find yourself forced away from lifeboats at gunpoint, told to wait until all women and children are safely away. But here's the tragic reality. There aren't enough lifeboats for everyone. Even if every boat had been filled to capacity and lowered successfully, they could accommodate only 1,178 people. With over 2,200 people on board, more than 1,000 are mathematically doomed no matter how well the evacuation proceeds. And the evacuation isn't proceeding well. Communication between different parts of the ship is breaking down. The lights are still on and the ship still has power. But the crew members managing the evacuation have lost contact with large portions of the ship's population. Hundreds of third-class passengers are still trapped in the lower decks, unable to find their way to the lifeboats. Chapter 6. The Slow Realization. 12 a.m. to 12:30 a.m. As we continue our peaceful journey toward sleep, let's follow your experience during the first crucial half hour after the collision, when the true scope of the disaster was slowly becoming apparent to those who knew where to look, but remained hidden from most passengers like yourself. It's now past midnight on April 15th, 1912. You've been wandering the corridors accessible to third-class passengers for about 20 minutes, trying to understand what happened and why the engines have stopped. The ship still feels stable beneath your feet, though you might notice that walking toward the front of the ship, toward the bow, feels slightly like walking downhill. Other passengers you encounter seem to share your puzzlement. Some have decided it's nothing serious and have returned to their cabins. Others, like you, continue to explore within the limited areas available to them. A few are trying to reach the upper decks to get a better sense of what's happening, but they're finding their way blocked by the usual barriers between classes. What you don't know is that above you, on the bridge and in the ship's most forward areas, a much more dramatic scene is unfolding. Captain Smith and Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, have completed their initial survey of the damage. Andrews, with his intimate knowledge of the ship's construction, has delivered a verdict that changes everything. The Titanic will sink, and she will sink within 2 hours. The first 6 watertight compartments are flooding. As each compartment fills, the weight of the water will drag the bow lower, allowing water to spill over the top of the watertight bulkheads into the next compartment. It's an unstoppable progression that will inevitably drag the entire ship beneath the surface of the North Atlantic. But this information isn't being shared with passengers yet. Captain Smith is still hoping that nearby ships will be able to assist before the situation becomes desperate. The wireless operators are sending out distress calls, and the crew is beginning to prepare the lifeboats, but quietly, without creating panic. This is another factor working against your survival. The decision to avoid panic by not immediately alerting passengers to the true scope of the danger. The intention is good. Panic can be deadly on a sinking ship. But the result is that precious time is being lost while passengers like you remain unaware of the need to take immediate action. Around 12:15 a.m., you might begin to notice more obvious signs that something serious is happening. Crew members are moving through the ship with greater urgency. You might see them opening storage areas and removing life jackets. Some passengers are beginning to put on these bulky, cork-filled vests, though many are treating it as a precaution rather than a necessity. The ship's band has been assembled and instructed to play music in the first-class lounge to help keep passengers calm. This might seem like a pleasant, civilized response to a minor emergency, but it's actually a sign that the crew knows the situation is serious enough to require psychological management of the passengers. If you manage to make your way to one of the areas where third-class passengers can access a small section of the upper decks, you might finally begin to see visual evidence of what has happened. The forward part of the ship is noticeably lower in the water than it was earlier in the evening. If you're observant, you might notice that the angle of the deck beneath your feet has changed subtly but measurably. But even these signs can be deceptive. The Titanic was so enormous that her sinking was happening slowly enough to seem manageable. Ships settled by inches rather than feet in these early stages. To passengers unfamiliar with maritime emergencies, the changes might seem minor, temporary, possibly even normal adjustments that large ships make in response to various conditions. Around 12:20 a.m., Captain Smith gives the order to begin loading the lifeboats. But this order comes with tragic instructions that will significantly reduce your chances of survival. Women and children first, and lifeboats are to be loaded from the upper decks only. This seems like a reasonable, civilized approach to an emergency evacuation, but it creates several deadly problems for passengers like you. First, as a third-class passenger, you're not on the upper decks where the lifeboats are being loaded. Second, the crew members supervising the evacuation are not familiar with the third-class areas of the ship and don't know how to efficiently guide passengers from the lower decks to the boat deck. Most critically, many of the crew members assigned to lifeboat duty have never participated in a full-scale evacuation drill. They know the basic procedures, but they've never practiced managing hundreds of passengers in darkness, with a ship that's slowly but perceptibly sinking beneath their feet. As you continue to move through the ship, trying to understand what's happening and what you should do, you're facing a deadly combination of factors: limited information, restricted movement, unfamiliar surroundings, and procedures that weren't designed for the reality of evacuating 2,200 people from a sinking ship in the middle of the night. The temperature outside has dropped below freezing, and even if you reach the boat deck, you'll find yourself in bitter cold that makes thinking and moving more difficult. Your hands will become clumsy, your decision-making will be impaired by cold and stress, and the lifeboats themselves will be difficult to manage in the harsh conditions. But perhaps most tragically, you're still operating under the assumption that rescue is likely, that this is a temporary emergency that will be resolved before anyone is seriously endangered. The idea that this magnificent, unsinkable ship could actually disappear beneath the waves, taking most of her passengers and crew with her, still seems impossible. As we continue our gentle journey towards sleep, let your breathing remain deep and regular, your body completely relaxed. The story we're sharing is peaceful and calming, even as it explores these dramatic historical events, helping to carry you gently toward restful dreams. Chapter 7. The Race Against Time. 12:30 a.m. to 1:30 a.m. Now, as your body continues to sink deeper into comfort and your mind drifts peacefully with our story, let's follow your experience during the most critical hour of the disaster, when your survival would depend on decisions and actions taken in increasingly desperate circumstances. It's now 12:30 a.m., 50 minutes after the collision, and the situation is becoming undeniably serious. The ship's bow is noticeably lower in the water, And even passengers in the interior sections can feel that something fundamental has changed about the Titanic's behavior in the water. You've been trying to make sense of the situation for nearly an hour now, moving through the corridors and common areas available to third-class passengers, observing the increasing activity of crew members and the growing concern among your fellow passengers. Some have found life jackets and put them on, the bulky, cork-filled vests making everyone look awkward and uncomfortable. But here's where your situation becomes truly desperate. You need to reach the boat deck, 7 levels above your current location, and you need to do it quickly. The lifeboats are being loaded on a women and children first basis, but they're being loaded from the upper decks only, and the crew members supervising the evacuation are not coming down to the third-class areas to guide passengers upward. The first lifeboat has already been lowered into the water. Lifeboat 7, with a capacity of 65 people, left the ship with only 27 aboard. This wasn't because there weren't enough passengers available. It was because the evacuation process was chaotic, unfamiliar, and hampered by the belief that the lifeboats were just a precaution until rescue ships arrived. But you know none of this. You're trying. Chapter 8. The final hour, 1:30 a.m. to 2:20 a.m. As we move into the final portion of our peaceful journey toward sleep, let's follow the last desperate hour of the Titanic, when survival became a matter of split-second decisions and pure chance. It's now 1:30 a.m., and the situation has moved beyond crisis into catastrophe. The ship's bow is so low in the water that the forward well deck is completely submerged. Water is beginning to pour through portholes and ventilation systems into areas that were never intended to flood. If you've managed to reach the boat deck, you're now facing the most difficult decisions of your life. Do you try to get into one of the remaining lifeboats, knowing that as a man, you might be refused? Do you stay on the ship and hope for rescue? Do you try to help other passengers reach safety, even though it might cost you your own chance at survival? The ship's band is still playing, having moved from the first-class lounge to the boat deck itself. Their music provides a surreal soundtrack to the evacuation. Ragtime and popular songs floating across the scene of increasing desperation. This image, the band playing as the ship sinks, will become one of the most iconic elements of the Titanic story. Around 1:40 a.m., the last lifeboat on the port side is lowered. If you haven't managed to get into a boat by now, your options are becoming extremely limited. There are still collapsible lifeboats on the roof of the officers' quarters, but reaching them and launching them requires technical knowledge and equipment that most passengers don't have. The ship's angle is now steep enough that walking becomes difficult. Furniture, luggage, and loose objects are sliding toward the bow. The sound of the ship herself is changing. Instead of the solid, confident creaking of a well-built vessel, there are now groaning, snapping sounds as the enormous stresses of sinking begin to tear the ship apart. If you're still in the interior of the ship, your situation is becoming hopeless. The corridors that were your highways for 4 days are now tilted at dangerous angles. Water is beginning to appear in areas that seemed completely safe just hours ago. The electric lights, which have provided comfort and guidance, are beginning to flicker as the ship's power systems are compromised by flooding. Around 2 a.m., the water reaches the boat deck itself. This is the point of no return. Anyone still on the ship when the water reaches this level will almost certainly not survive. The remaining passengers and crew are now faced with a choice between staying with the ship as she makes her final plunge, or jumping into the North Atlantic and hoping to survive in the freezing water long enough for rescue. The water temperature is 28 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to cause death within 15 to 30 minutes, even for strong swimmers wearing life jackets. Most people who enter the water will be unconscious within 2 minutes and dead within 15. These aren't opinions or estimates. They're the physiological realities of cold water immersion. At 2:05 a.m., the last lifeboat is finally launched. Collapsible D leaves the ship with 44 people aboard. Everyone remaining on the Titanic, over 1,500 people, is now facing death in the North Atlantic. The ship's lights fail at 2:17 a.m., plunging the scene into darkness. Without the comforting glow of electric lights, the full horror of the situation becomes clear. The Titanic is now standing almost vertically in the water, her stern high in the air, her bow completely submerged. The sounds are indescribable. The groaning of metal under impossible stress, the crash of furniture and equipment sliding toward the bow, the roar of water rushing into spaces that were never meant to hold it. And most terribly, the cries of over 1,000 people who know they are about to die. At 2:20 a.m., the RMS Titanic breaks apart and disappears beneath the surface of the North Atlantic Ocean. The unsinkable ship, the pride of human engineering, the symbol of technological progress, is gone in less than 3 hours. But the tragedy isn't over. Now begins the most horrible part of the entire disaster, the struggle for survival in the freezing water. Over 1,500 people are now in the ocean, most wearing life jackets that will keep them afloat, but do nothing to protect them from the killing cold. The lifeboats, many of them only partially filled, are now the only refuge in hundreds of miles of empty ocean. But most of the boat crews are afraid to return to pick up survivors, fearing that desperate people in the water will swamp their boats and kill everyone. So the people in the water die. They die of hypothermia, their body temperatures dropping until their hearts simply stop beating. They die calling for help that doesn't come, floating in their life jackets until the cold claims them one by one. Chapter 9. The Aftermath and Why You Wouldn't Have Survived. As we near the end of our long, peaceful journey towards sleep, let's reflect on why your chances of survival aboard the Titanic would have been so much smaller than you might have imagined. The statistics tell a stark story. Of the 2,224 people aboard the Titanic, only 710 survived. That's a survival rate of just 32%. But these numbers hide dramatic differences based on class, gender, and age. If you were a first-class passenger, your chances were relatively good. 37% of first-class men survived, and a remarkable 97% of first-class women and children lived through the disaster. The proximity to lifeboats, the assistance of crew members, and the knowledge of the ship's layout all worked in favor of first-class passengers. Second-class passengers had intermediate survival rates. 16% of men and 86% of women and children. They were higher in the ship than third-class passengers, but not as close to the lifeboats as first-class passengers. But if you were a third-class passenger, which statistically you most likely would have been, your survival rate was devastating. Only 16% of third-class men survived, and 49% of third-class women and children. Despite making up the largest group of passengers, third-class passengers had the lowest survival rates. Why were these differences so dramatic? The answer lies in all the factors we've explored during our journey together tonight. Location, information, access, and assistance all determined who lived and who died. Third-class passengers were located in the most dangerous parts of the ship, low in the hull, far from lifeboats, behind locked gates and barriers. When the evacuation began, no one came to guide them to safety. They had to find their own way through unfamiliar corridors, up stairways they'd never used, past barriers they weren't normally allowed to cross. Many third-class passengers didn't even know the ship was sinking until it was too late. The subtle nature of the collision, the lack of general alarm, and the crew's decision to avoid panic by withholding information all worked against the people who needed help most. The language barriers were also deadly. Many third-class passengers spoke little or no English. Instructions shouted by crew members were meaningless to Swedish farmers, Italian families, Irish laborers, and Chinese sailors. They couldn't ask for help, couldn't understand directions, and couldn't communicate their desperate need for assistance. Even if you had made it to the boat deck, your troubles wouldn't have been over. The women and children first protocol, while noble in intention, was enforced inconsistently and sometimes brutally. Some officers interpreted it as women and children only, forcing back men at gunpoint even when lifeboats had empty seats. The crew's unfamiliarity with emergency procedures was another deadly factor. Most had never participated in a full evacuation drill. They didn't know how to efficiently load and lower the lifeboats, how to manage panicked passengers, or how to coordinate the evacuation of different sections of the ship. The lifeboats themselves were inadequate, not just in number, but in the crew's ability to use them effectively. Many were lowered only partially filled because crew members didn't know how many people they could safely hold, because passengers were reluctant to leave the ship, or because there simply wasn't time to load them properly. But perhaps most tragically, many people who could have been saved were killed by the rescue efforts themselves. The decision not to return to pick up people in the water condemned hundreds to death by hypothermia. The lifeboats had room for more survivors, but fear and poor leadership prevented rescue attempts that could have saved hundreds of lives. The Carpathia, the ship that rescued the Titanic's survivors, didn't arrive until 3:30 a.m., more than an hour after the ship sank. By then, almost everyone in the water was dead. The few who survived in the water were saved by luck. They managed to reach overturned lifeboats or debris that provided some protection from the cold. Chapter 10. Lessons and Final Reflections. As we complete our long journey through this tragic night in history, and as your body continues to relax deeper into peaceful sleep, let's reflect on what the Titanic disaster teaches us about survival, preparation, and the importance of knowledge in times of crisis. The Titanic wasn't destroyed by one catastrophic failure, but by a series of smaller failures and oversights that combined into tragedy. The ice warnings that were ignored, the insufficient lifeboat capacity, the lack of emergency training for passengers, the rigid class distinctions that prevented efficient evacuation. All of these factors contributed to the disaster. But perhaps the most important lesson is that survival often depends less on courage or strength than on information, preparation, and access. The bravest third-class passenger had less chance of survival than a cowardly first-class passenger, simply because of where they were located on the ship and what resources were available to them. This teaches us something important about emergencies in our own lives. Whether it's a natural disaster, a medical emergency, or any other crisis, preparation and knowledge can be more valuable than physical strength or bravery. Knowing evacuation routes, understanding emergency procedures, having emergency supplies, these mundane preparations can mean the difference between life and death. The Titanic disaster also shows us the importance of questioning authority and assumptions. The ship was called unsinkable, and this confidence led to complacency. Passengers and crew alike believed that the technology was so advanced, the safety features so complete, that a major disaster was impossible. But the ocean doesn't care about human confidence or technological achievements. The iceberg that sank the Titanic was following the same laws of physics that govern all icebergs. The cold water that killed over 1,500 people was obeying the same biological principles that make hypothermia deadly in any circumstances. If you had been aboard the Titanic, your survival would have depended largely on factors beyond your control. Your economic class, your cabin location, your familiarity with maritime procedures, your physical ability to navigate unfamiliar spaces in darkness and chaos. But it also would have depended on decisions you could control. Whether to investigate unusual sounds, whether to put on a life jacket immediately, whether to move toward lifeboats even when the danger didn't seem immediate. The survivors of the Titanic weren't necessarily the strongest or bravest people on board. They were the ones who had the right information at the right time, who were in the right place when decisions needed to be made, who had access to resources that others lacked. As you drift now toward peaceful sleep, carried along by the gentle rhythm of this story, consider how the lessons of the Titanic might apply to your own life. What emergency preparations could you make? What knowledge could you gain? What assumptions in your own life might be worth questioning? The people aboard the Titanic were real individuals with hopes, dreams, fears, and families. They weren't just statistics in a historical disaster. They were people like you, making the best decisions they could with the information available to them. Some were lucky, some were unlucky, but all of them were caught in circumstances that tested human courage, ingenuity, and endurance to their limits. The story of the Titanic reminds us that we live in a world where safety is never guaranteed, where the most advanced technology can fail, where the most careful plans can go wrong. But it also reminds us that preparation, knowledge, and clear thinking in crisis situations can make survival possible, even in the most desperate circumstances. As you continue to sink deeper into relaxation, your breathing slow and steady, your body completely at rest, let the story of the Titanic serve as a gentle reminder of both human vulnerability and human resilience. The disaster was terrible, but it also revealed extraordinary acts of courage, selflessness, and dignity in the face of certain death. The band that played until the ship sank, the officers who stayed at their posts, the passengers who gave up their lifeboat seats to others, the crew members who worked to save lives until the very end. These examples show us that even in the darkest circumstances, humans can choose to act with honor and compassion. Now, as our journey together comes to an end, let yourself drift completely into peaceful sleep. The story of the Titanic, with all its tragedy and heroism, becomes part of the tapestry of history that connects us all. Rest now, knowing that you've learned something important about survival, about preparation, and about the fragility and strength of human life. Sleep peacefully, and let the gentle rhythm of the ocean carry you into restful dreams.